Hello. Hi there. Daniel Kirsch again. Here today to talk to you about foreign policy in American government. And this is usually the last chapter in American government textbooks. I do want to go through some key terms with you first. And then I want to talk about some of the larger concepts when it comes to talking about politics between nations and especially the role that the U.S. has in the world. So to start off, what is foreign policy? Right, that basic definition is really just any interaction that the U.S. government has with other countries and beyond the borders of the U.S. And also, that action that's on behalf of citizens and residents of the U.S. And it's fair to say, there's a lot of consensus that the U.S. foreign policy in the modern era really began after World War II. So after World War II, the U.S. was part of, and arguably the strongest part of the Allied forces that won World War II. And with those victorious allies, they were the UK, France, China, and the USSR. So these five victors of that conflict in World War II were victorious over Germany and Italy, and the rest of the Axis powers in Japan. So let me write those on the board here real quick. So the US, UK, France, China, and the USSR. Okay. And they were victorious over, Germany and Italy. I guess I won't write those up there. And the rest of the Axis powers were Japan and their allies. So these five countries did many things after World War II. But one of the things they did that was very important is become the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. United Nations they also are the only five legitimate, and that is law-abiding, members currently of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as well as the five members of the Nuclear Club that don't include people who have flouted the last test ban treaty, meaning there's a ban on even testing large-scale nuclear devices now all over the world. But let me make sure I get this right. So India and Pakistan are not signatories. They also have nuclear weapons, and it's widely acknowledged that Israel has at least one nuclear weapon, even if they haven't officially acknowledged that fact. And South Africa had been for a while in a joint project with Israel to build a weapon, but they withdrew from that. And North Korea now at least seems to publicly acknowledge that they own a nuclear weapon. So India and Pakistan and North Korea are the five kind of non-UN Security Council and non-test ban treaty abiding non-test ban treaty abiding nations to be engaging in nuclear tests and possess nuclear weapons that are actively pointed at other countries. So the five legitimate, other than India and Pakistan, which are hostile to each other, India and Pakistan are hostile to each other. I'll put them up here. Are these five. And they also happen to be, with the exception perhaps of France, five of the leading naval powers in the world. And of course, USSR is no longer in existence. Russia has taken their place. Let's see. And there are several aircraft carriers in the world, and 11 of them, I believe there are 12, and 11 of them are held by the U.S. If you've never seen an aircraft carrier, they should remind you of that Avengers ship in the Avengers movies, but they're in the air in the Avengers movies. But they're in the water in the real world. And apparently the U.S. has 11 of them, and I think, China, India, France, Russia, the U.K. all have one. But apparently some of the other countries that share ownership of them, but the U.S. has 11. That should give you an idea of the kind of dominance the U.S. has not only on the seas but also just military presence worldwide. So the U.S. is widely acknowledged to be often pardon the gendered term, but the world's policeman. This really began certainly after World War II, where it helped found the UN, of course, but also with the UN. These three countries were part of a new organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is formed. Basically, it was the Western advance of the Allied powers that were able to occupy Western Europe. So NATO. They were able to form a new organization that is also perhaps known as the U.S. Nuclear Umbrella, that if you invade one of those countries that belongs to NATO, then the U.S. military, which is the overarching superpower of the world, will, rain its fury down upon you, that kind of thing. So China and the USSR were, despite the fact that they were allies of the U.S. in the World War II, very quickly became adversaries of the U.S. in this new Cold War. And so the Cold War has a long history. It really goes from this time period, 1945 and thereabouts. This is the point at which the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, decided that they were not going to cooperate in reestablishing the governments of Western Europe, but that the Soviet Union, in fact, would take the Eastern Front of what they had kind of battled and won through the Eastern Front of Eastern Europe all the way to Germany and Eastern Germany, which includes countries like Poland and Hungary and what's now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But all those countries in the East and the Western powers, the US, the UK, and France, all sort of agreed that they would take the Western advancement into Western Europe and Germany and everything, west of Germany. So it even split the country of Germany into West Germany and East Germany. The city of Berlin, that was subject to all of this as well, they had these kind of US, UK, and France dominated zones of Berlin, but one of those zones was designated as East Berlin, or just Berlin under Soviet control, and geographically, though, it was within East Germany. So there was a portion of it called West Berlin under the control of the US, the UK, and France. And at one point, Stalin, the Soviet dictator, had attempted to shut down the roads to allow food to get into West Berlin, and that was occupied by the Allied forces. I actually had an uncle who was a pilot during what was called the Berlin Airlift. And so, he wrote poetry about it later. And it was this effort to bring food and supplies into the area of Allied occupied Berlin in the 1940s, so as to kind of avoid the road-based Berlin blockade that Stalin had set up. So he was attempting to gain control of West Berlin and incorporate it into East Berlin and East Germany and kind of the Soviet military and economic empire. So the Allied victory diplomatically there was a lot of public relations about it. So the Western powers and the Eastern powers mostly divided up Europe militarily between the two of them. This was part of this 45-year geopolitical, as they say, chess game. So not to trivialize it, it really was the driving force behind much of U.S. foreign policy, and certainly at the time, the driving force between Soviet foreign policy, which we would know today as more, Russian foreign policy. And I'll get to the difference between that very soon. So these three areas of the Cold War defined there were three eras of the Cold War. And let me write down what they were. Let's see. So the three eras of the Cold War really define the way the U.S. and the Soviet Union understood each other in terms of their relationship. They really had divided up the world into these military economic zones, these opposing camps where every nation in the world was economically and militarily allied with one of these two countries, the U.S. on the one hand and the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics based in Moscow, on the other. There was a non-aligned movement, however. There were about 70 countries, spearheaded mostly by India and other countries that were in the developing world, that said they were not aligned with either of these two sides exclusively. But there were many in the U.S. who felt that they were more, that India and the non-aligned movement was more sympathetic to the Soviet side. But essentially the non-aligned movement existed so they'd be able to advocate for themselves and trade between these two blocks of nations because they thought that neither one was acting entirely in their interest. And a lot of them, as I said, were developing countries. But the Soviet Union, the idea the Soviet Union was a threat, needed to be contained, was a U.S. idea. It was originated as a memo written by a State Department official named George Kennan. But he was anonymous at this point. He called himself, Mr. X, I believe, during the Truman administration. And this contained the policy that seemed to have some teeth because the U.S. Had just used an atomic bomb on its enemies in the 1940s. So that threat, the threat of the Soviet Union still existed, and it was attempting to develop its own nuclear capabilities at the time. But the idea was the containment was containing Soviet influence around the world. And by that it meant not just Soviet military occupation, but also Soviet alliances with countries that seemed to share their socialist worldview or maybe neo-socialist worldview. So any country that attempted some sort of reform internally. And the classic model would be something like, and I won't name any countries specifically, but if a developing country especially decided they were going to take the land that was held by people who lived in other countries, often the US or Europe, and carve it up and distribute it to their peasant population, that was considered to be by that country a land reform that was socialistic. And the Soviet Union might get wind of it and say, well, we really applaud what you're doing here, giving money back to peasants and throwing off the dominance of the U.S. and the Europeans. And so we'll give you some money. And if you sign some kind of treaty with us, because we like what you're doing, it was kind of almost a knee-jerk reaction that the U.S. would be opposed to this land reform, perhaps in no small part because they had, there were U.S. interests within that country also economically. But usually the people from another country who owned a lot of land in your country are usually U.S. citizens and U.S. companies. So, so it was very easy to carve this narrative that, the poor are being helped somehow by the Soviet Union, or at least that's the narrative that the Soviet Union was trying to put out there. So generally, the U.S. and the Soviet Union economically, you could say philosophically, but not really the point. Economically, they disagreed and were rivals. And so they would disagree militarily as well. So in a lot of places around the world, there would be these what are called proxy conflicts, proxy wars. Like in Korea in the 1950s, the North Koreans were allied with the Soviet Union. The South Koreans were allied with the U.S., and they had a war in the 1950s that apparently was never over, never legally stopped for decades. But essentially hostilities ended there. There wasn't a peace treaty or anything, but hostilities ended really during the Eisenhower administration after about 6 years. And so the Korean Peninsula has been divided between those two countries in the 1950s. And North Korea has actually gone through this kind of dynastic transformation. There's the third generation right now from the founder of North Korea to the Kim family. So I don't want to get the names wrong exactly, but Kim is the family name. So from containment, this is the Vietnam War and the Korean War grew out of the policies of containment. The U.S. had felt like they had to kind of beat back any sentiment that sounded like communism or socialism, not just in the U.S. but around the world, because socialism was kind of a wholly owned property of the Soviet Union at the time, right? It was the Soviet Union had kind of an exclusive on the definition of socialism, and so they also considered themselves to be kind of automatic allies to any socialist or communist movement around the world. So essentially, because they had wedded that so much with the interests of the Soviet Republic, and really by extension their military policy, their economic policy, uh, they were they felt like they were obligated to ideologically align and then militarily align with anyone who called themselves socialist or communist, at least initially. Um, so for their part, they did attempt to gain influence with those countries and gain new allies when they saw a new regime coming into place that was not entirely allied with the U.S. Or cooperating with American interests. Um, so it was very much kind of a bipolar, binary, power dynamic in the world. And it was a zero sum game. Any loss of U.S. interests seemed to be then a gain, at least implicitly, but also militarily and materially by the Soviet Union at the time too. So the Soviet Union's tactic was, okay, so you're not a friend of the U.S., so neither are we, so let's be allies. And we'll give you some money, maybe some arms. That's how the Cuban Missile Crisis started. It was Fidel Castro expressing some sympathy with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Revolution, before and after the Cuban Revolution. And the USSR, the Soviet Union, had asked if they could locate some missiles in Cuba, and so on and so on. There was what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis between the Kennedy administration and the Castro regime and the Soviet Union. And so they very nearly came to a nuclear conflict in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the US in 1961. So those proxy wars, like Vietnam, so that ended, with no nuclear conflict, but very scary moment. But let me get back to these proxy wars. Like Vietnam lasted 10 years or so, and it was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Ended up being between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese, and North Vietnamese won that war. So the U.S. had sent hundreds of thousands of American troops, and in the end, 58,000 American soldiers died in that war. But also to keep in mind, the death toll overall in that whole conflict was roughly 1 million people in Vietnam. So that includes civilians, of course, by and large. It was truly a tragic circumstance because, I explained that there was the same circumstance. There was this land reform. There was this kind of communist ideologue who was the leader of this movement, Ho Chi Minh, who gained a lot of followers in the North and eventually had this Congress assembled. They called it the Viet Cong for short, the Vietnamese Congress of People's Deputies, something like that. So that's where that comes from, that name Viet Cong. They felt the U.S. was an imperial power that was taking advantage of them, and they wanted to kick the U.S. companies out and take back their land. The U.S. and these companies, by the way, were mostly guarded by the French military up until after World War II. That was back when it was called Indochina, at least by France and by the imperial powers. So the U.S. essentially inherited this military protection in the region for U.S. interests. But the conflict itself just kept spiraling out of control in the 60s and 70s to the point where it was just an unwinnable war and a terrible kind of public relations stain for the U.S. And it eventually ended in the 1970s. But it permanently did a lot of damage to goodwill between the U.S. electorate and the U.S. government. It certainly was one of the reasons why Lyndon Johnson couldn't run for re-election in 1968 and why Nixon was essentially impeached. He was almost impeached, but in order to widen the conflict, he basically declared war on a country next door to Vietnam, Cambodia. He just bombed Cambodia. So that was one of the articles of impeachment, that you're not really allowed to do that within the U.S. government without declaring war, without getting some kind of support from Congress, and he just didn't get that. But this was kind of a proxy conflict, which led to Nixon saying, well, I just want to try to make peace with the Soviet Union and not war, and maybe just learn to coexist rather than go to war. He had been this fervent Richard Nixon, the president at the time, had been this fervent anti-communist early in his career, this anti-Soviet politician. So it was considered to be the only time when a U.S. president, politician at all, could really have the credibility to say, I speak on behalf of all Americans when I say, we just want to be at peace with you, Soviet Union. So this word détente, this French word of peaceful coexistence, was just going to be what they thought was going to be the new era of U.S. and Soviet interaction. But about a decade later, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he began making speeches, for example, in Berlin, this famous one I'm thinking of in particular, in West Berlin, saying that, look, there's a wall that East Berlin had put up in 1961, the East German government, so really the Soviet government in 1961, to make sure that East Berliners couldn't escape from East Berlin into the West. And because it was increasingly this Stalinist kind of totalitarian state that was actually pretty broke, they didn't have a lot of money or resources, and it wasn't very democratic either. So they attempted, I should say the US attempted in the 80s to really ramp up pressure on the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union were in kind of this eternal arms race. Seems like it was eternal. What was interesting about it is that even though they had the same number of people that the US had, they were both very rich in natural resources and both had a lot of influence around the globe. And they had both very clear ideological lines in the sand: communism, capitalism, socialism, communism, and democracy, liberal democracy. The Soviet Union was actually a very poor country compared to the U.S. Very poor country. I'd say their GDP was about a third of what the U.S.'s was, but their defense budget was the same. Hard to see how they could afford that, at least in the long run. So they just pumped all their money into the military, into arms manufacturing as well. And I think Reagan, to his credit, could see this. He also saw that there were one or two recessions away, it wasn't necessarily his political orientation alone as an anti-communist conservative Republican, but he did famously say, tear down this wall, to the leader of the Soviet Union at this time in West Berlin. So it was kind of this signal they were going to start ramping up pressure by building up their own American military arms. And once that happened, it would force the Soviet Union to build even more of a military presence than they already had. And they simply couldn't afford that. So by the time 1990 rolled around, the Soviet Union, in many different ways, and this is one for the history books, they had a couple of bad agricultural years in terms of commodities. And they just did a lot of borrowing just to be able to build up the military. And they folded. They just couldn't make the payments on their loans. They couldn't afford any of this. They had Chernobyl happen in 1986, that terrible nuclear accident at one of their nuclear energy manufacturing facilities in Ukraine. And that just really did a lot of damage to their economy, their image around the world. They actually had about 15 or 16 republics in the Soviet Union, Russia being the largest one. But today the U.S. has about 350 million people, and back then the Soviet Union had about 300 million people, just a little bit more than the U.S., but the largest country in the Soviet Union was Russia, with the most ethnic Russians, and they had about 150 million people. So it's about half the population of the Soviet Union was Russia. So the largest portion certainly, but not the only portion. And they were the entity that survived the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation. The military pulled back from all of Eastern Europe, from all of their Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan, Belarus, and the Ukraine. And all of those places that had Soviet troops in them, and a substantial Russian population as well. They had all been in this what's called the Russian sphere of influence. It had been the Soviet Empire before it went Soviet and communist in 1917. But at this point in 1990, they were kind of legal federal entities like Nebraska or South Carolina. It would be like if the U.S. folded financially, but Texas and California were still around. And that's kind of what the Soviet Union breakup was like. So after that, the U.S. really drifted in its foreign policy, at least in its public image of foreign policy, I'd have to say, for about 10 years. They had a lot of confidence, during the Clinton administration, and then the Bush administration. In the Clinton administration, they believed they were kind of at the end of history. They had won the Cold War, this kind of mutually assured destruction of the 1980s, where these two militaries were facing off, a little bit like the metaphor of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. That if anyone fires one nuclear weapon, then it will create this chain reaction that will destroy the world. So that was mutually assured destruction. But that was over as of 1990 and 1991. The end. So during the Bush administration, Bush the Elder, George H.W. Bush's administration, the Soviet Union fell, and the U.S. was the only superpower, and they were trying to stabilize the world. But that's when the specter of terrorism really reared its head. And after the events of September 11th, 2001, where 3,000 people were killed by terrorist attacks in New York and D.C., they had this new kind of ready-made ideology, this military ideology. The war on terror became the new justification for U.S. foreign policy. And so the Bush administration was able to launch 2 wars in one term. One thing, that was unheard of, at least since Vietnam in the 1970s. So in 30 years, the U.S. hadn't had that kind of military engagement. But it was really unheard of, even 10 years before, that the U.S. would be involved in a full-scale war, let alone 2 really Vietnam-level conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so both of them were under this war on terror framework, and the Iraq War certainly was not in retaliation necessarily to September 11th, but it really was an exercise in what was later acknowledged as preemption. And this idea that you will have to go to war with this country eventually, so it's better that you attack them first because they'll eventually attack you, and you want the element of surprise. So the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 in March, and Afghanistan. As soon as the U.S. ended its 20-year presence there, recent in 2021, the Taliban reemerged as the power and control of the government there. And even then, after that, there were a few thousand troops. There were a few thousand troops left in for a long time between 2014 and 2021 in Afghanistan. But in 2005 and 6, at the height of it, there were 100,000 plus troops in both places from the U.S. And there's only about 1 million active duty service members around the world in the U.S. military. So they had to pull in a lot of reserve units. Some, like the Vermont National Guard, is one headline I remember reading. I remember reading back then they had not been called into any kind of active duty since World War II. Or at least hadn't been deployed internationally since World War II. And all these reservists were activated, and they had to be reactivated several times. So it wasn't really their choice. Kind of a replacement for the draft of the Vietnam War, and how unpopular that was, and how it really made the war hit home for a lot of families that might not have paid attention otherwise. But eventually Iraq grew to not being a very popular war, and it certainly was helped propel Democrats to congressional victory in 2006 pretty overwhelmingly. And I would certainly argue that Obama's victory in 2008 owed a lot of it to anti-Iraq war sentiment as well. So I've talked a lot about U.S. sentiment around foreign policy. One thing I haven't really talked about, and that is kind of covered in your textbook, is the fact that it's sort of a chicken and egg question. So I don't want to say it's a reflection, but U.S. economic policy is very much tied to U.S. foreign policy, and there's a reason why the U.S. has allied with so many countries and not allied with others, and why it's the world superpower. So, pivoting a little, need to talk about China. So China is increasingly the primary military and economic power the U.S. is seeking to contrast itself with and move against in military, economic, and public image terms. There's increasing attention in the U.S. media, for example, to China's human rights record and its lack of democratic institutions. But the thing you should know is that the U.S., and you've probably heard some of these statistics, but the U.S. is home to about 4 or 5% of the world's population, but controls about 25% of the world's wealth. And it produces 25% of the world's economic output annually. So, as well as I should say, the 25 or 30% of the world's waste in terms of carbon emissions and just total waste environmentally. So the U.S. is disproportionately influential on the rest of the world, given those 11 aircraft carriers I mentioned, and the military spending and the military presence, not to mention the economic output and the fact that the U.S. is a net importer these days of goods and services. Let's see. Pardon me. They don't export as much as they don't necessarily export as much as they did between 2000 and 2010. But most economists say that as a direct result of a series of treaties that allowed U.S. companies to export jobs to countries with lower wages, the U.S. lost 33% of its manufacturing jobs between the years 2000 and 2010. So 1/3 of the manufacturing that the U.S. was doing was gone in the space of 10 years. And so today, this is one statistic, I want you to understand in terms of who the kind of real major players are on the world stage and what that really means. Because there's only a certain number of countries that engage in manufacturing and have a large disproportionate influence economically on the world. And in a way that kind of shows their technological and maybe socially mobilizable superiority. So here's some statistics that I think you should know. So 20% of all world manufacturing is done in China. Home to about 1.5 billion people, so that's 5 times as many people as the U.S., but they have about 20% of the world's manufactured goods. Almost 20% of manufacturing is done in the U.S. And also with about 350 million people. I could write some of this down. So again, global manufacturing. And this is just making things, making goods, right? And China has 20% of that. The U.S., 20% of that. Maybe we'll say a little bit less than 20%. And the EU, the European Union, has a little under 20%. And Japan has about 10%. But if you kind of don't say Japan, but you say U.S. allied Southeast Asia, and that's really, we'll say Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan together, that's also a little under 20%. So that's where most of the goods are manufactured in the world is the U.S., the EU, and China, and also significantly, U.S. allies in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And I'll say another 5% are in U.S. allied, what are called Anglophone countries, English-speaking countries like the UK, Australia, and Canada. So that's another 5%. Another 5% of world manufacturing is done in those 3 countries. So that's really where most of the world's goods are produced. And the U.S. used to be a much bigger share of all that. It used to be much closer to China. And Japan, is even is part of that. So certainly China is up there in terms of its superiority and manufacturing output, but it's nowhere close to the U.S. in terms of military spending, at least not right now. The U.S. has about 40% of world military spending, and China about 15%. The European Union has about 10% of all worldwide military spending. And so when I say the European Union, I mean, let me mention the kind of five biggest nations in Europe currently. So that's Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain, and all the countries that belong to that kind of supranational unit, the European Union. China certainly has a lot more active troops than the U.S., but certainly to the U.S., China is a growing rival for superpower status in the world, especially if they keep up the rate of growth that they currently have. But it seems they're still, at least right now, very far behind the U.S. in terms of weapons production and aircraft carriers and military presence. But that's growing, the influence around the world beyond China. But just one more thing. Besides manufacturing, in terms of natural resources like, oil, gas, timber, coal, and other natural resources that are traded in high volume around the world, the top 10 countries in terms of natural resources are in no particular order: Brazil, China, Iran, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Australia, and I think I'm missing a couple in there, and Venezuela. So those 7 or 8 have more oil, gas, timber, coal, and other natural resources traded in high volume around the world than the rest of the world combined. So it's all those countries that have those natural resources and have that manufacturing capability that really determine the attention that the U.S. has to pay to all of them. And to the extent that they're able to preserve their trade with all those countries to be able to fuel its own economy is to the extent the U.S. military needs to be involved in either guaranteeing the security of those nations or, ramping up pressure on those nations to the point where they even fund sometimes opposition figures to attempt to topple regimes, do a little regime change on behalf of U.S. interests. So some of the other terms in your textbook are either easily defined, so I won't go into them except to say that maybe realism and liberalism are worth talking about, and we'll just leave it at that. In realist thinking, so this is kind of a theory of politics worldwide, in foreign policy, in a nutshell, realists start from the premise that war is inevitable, and you can either delay war by a series of alliances and treaties between powerful allies that seem to guarantee some mutual security between nation states. Liberals, on the other hand, in the practice of liberalism and the kind of policy and intellectual orientation of global liberalism, does not start from the idea that war is inevitable. It allows from the possibility that war can happen, but it mostly thinks that that institutions of cooperation can be built across nation states, and perhaps the nation system can evolve to one that involves more cooperation and democracy than current institutions allow for, and that respect for human rights certainly more than currently exists can be achieved. So they think all of that is possible. Realists don't believe really any of that's possible at the extreme end of realism anyway. They think domestically it might be possible within one country to stop war. They don't think international institutions are capable of enforcing any kind of prohibition on war or even really human rights abuses. So it's more of a question of how long can you avert war, and what are some of those institutions that may be able to help with that. So there is kind of a gray area between the two. And lastly, I want to talk about this contrast between different kinds of action that take place, both among realists and liberals. It's also the difference between maybe unilateral action and multilateral action. And unilateral action is what realists tend to think is the bread and butter of the international system. It's done on behalf of one country or for one country or just by one country. That's unilateral action. And multilateral action is undertaken with a coalition. So, for example, in the Gulf War in 1991, where George H.W. Bush and the U.S. government assembled a coalition of 19 member countries to essentially kick out Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military from Kuwait its neighbor, its kind of high oil producing neighbor that was an ally of the U.S. They essentially they invaded that oil rich country, and so the U.S. did that. They had a very short war. They kicked Saddam Hussein out, the U.S. and their allies kicked them out, and then they went home. That's a multilateral action. A unilateral action is something a little bit more like what George W. Bush did when he invaded Iraq. He mostly did it by, the U.S. mostly did it alone, but they did have some kind of token alliances from others. I call them token because they didn't really contribute much in the way of troops, but they just said, we agree, the U.S. should do this. But places like Germany and France, many other allies expressed displeasure and disagreement with U.S. policy there. So that's about it. And maybe that's what perhaps doomed a lot of the U.S. effort in Afghanistan from the start, certainly in Iraq. Okay, I think that's all we'll go into today. If you have questions, please let me know, but I hope this has been somewhat of a helpful guide for you. Just have a good day, and thanks very much for watching.